classic mystery in the tradition of Agatha Christie, set in 1958, Hartwell-on-Wye, England. Chapter 1. The Third Thursday of the Month. The Hartwell-on-Wye Knitting Society met on the third Thursday of every month, in the front parlour of No. 14 Glebe Road, which belonged to Mrs. Audrey Prentice, and smelled, in the most agreeable way, of beeswax polish and slightly scorched wool. It was October 1958, and the parlour was warm and amber-lit, and outside the sash windows the village of Hartwell-on-Wye was conducting itself with the muffled, purposeful quietude of an English village in autumn. Miss Jane Marple had been staying with her old friend Agnes Fellows for 10 days. Agnes had a comfortable cottage at the good end of Mill Lane, a slight weakness of the chest that required fresh country air, and a standing invitation to the Knitting Society, which she had extended to her guest with the particular earnestness of a woman who believes that knitting and company are mutually restorative. Miss Marple had no difficulty agreeing. She had been knitting for 60 years, and she was of the settled opinion that one could learn almost everything worth knowing about a place by sitting quietly in a room where its inhabitants felt at ease. There were 7 members present that October evening, including Miss Marple and Agnes. The others were Mrs. Audrey Prentice, their hostess, a brisk and capable woman of 62 who kept biscuits in a tin with a hunting scene on the lid and opinions about everything in a similar state of readiness. Mrs. Ruth Calloway, who was 58, inclined to sentiment and currently knitting a complicated lace border that was giving her considerable trouble. Miss Winifred Spark, the retired postmistress, 55, with a face made for precision and a memory that retained everything anyone in Hartwell had ever said or posted. Mr. Oliver Fenn, who was the group's only male member and had joined 2 years ago under the stated pretext of learning to knit, but was widely understood to attend for the company and the biscuits, and Mrs. Josephine Holt, who sat slightly apart from the others with her work in her lap and said very little, which Miss Marple noted with the quiet attentiveness she brought to all things. Mrs. Josephine Holt was 47, the youngest in the room, and she had come to Hartwell 18 months ago with her husband, Mr. Barnaby Holt, who managed the accounts for several local firms. She was knitting a dark red cardigan with a neat, practiced hand, and her eyes moved occasionally to Mrs. Prentice with an expression that was not quite hostility and not quite nervousness, but something precisely calibrated between the two. "The question," Mrs. Prentice was saying, with the air of someone closing an argument that had been open for several meetings, "is whether the society should undertake a collective project for the Christmas bazaar or whether each member should contribute individually. I have always found the collective approach produces a more coherent result." "You have always found the collective approach produces your preferred result," said Miss Winifred Spark, without looking up from her needles, with the frankness of a woman who had been saying exactly what she thought for 30 years and saw no reason to stop. There was a small, appreciative silence. Agnes covered a smile. "Mr. Fenn ate a biscuit, I think," said Ruth Calloway carefully, in the tone she used for preventing small conflicts from becoming large ones, "that perhaps we might manage both, a collective centerpiece and individual contributions." Mrs. Prentice considered this as though it had been suggested by someone less reliable. Mrs. Holt said nothing. She turned her work, examined the reverse, and continued knitting. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in the corner chair nearest the window, a position that offered an unimpeded view of the room without requiring active participation, worked steadily on her blue wool and listened. She was knitting a bed jacket for Agnes, and she was also, in the particular division of attention she had developed over many decades, cataloguing everything about Mrs. Josephine Holt: the dark red cardigan, the precise hands, the careful eyes, the way she sat as though she had a perfect right to be there, and was simultaneously reminding herself of that fact. People who were genuinely comfortable in a room did not need to remind themselves. The reminding was its own kind of evidence. At 8:30, while Ruth Calloway was showing Agnes a new way of managing a lace decrease, and Miss Spark and Mrs. Prentice were engaged in a territorial discussion about the layout of the bazaar stall, Miss Marple found herself next to Josephine Holt at the tea table. "Are you enjoying Hartwell?" she asked, in the pleasant, mildly inquisitive manner that people who do not expect to be important to anyone assumed it was merely social. "Very much," said Josephine Holt. Her voice was measured. "It's a quieter life than I was used to." "Where did you come from?" "Northumberland, a small town." She poured tea with a steady hand. My husband's work brought us south. And your own work? Before Hartwell, a brief pause one fraction too long. I was in insurance administration. For some years. She handed Miss Marple a cup. And you, Miss Marple? Agnes says you live in St. Mary Mead. All my life, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, and let the conversation move elsewhere. She sat back in the corner chair with her tea and her knitting, and thought about insurance administration, and the pause before it, and the way Mrs. Holt's eyes returned to Mrs. Prentice at intervals, as regular as the beat of a metronome. The evening ended at 9:30, with the biscuit tin nearly empty, and no collective decision reached about the bazaar, which was the usual outcome. Members wrapped themselves into coats and said their goodbyes in the little hallway, and Miss Marple, leaving last with Agnes, heard Mrs. Prentice says to Josephine Holt, in a voice dropped but not quite dropped enough, "I would like a word. Before next week, at your convenience." And the tone of the phrase did not suggest convenience was truly the point. Josephine Holt said, "Of course," in a voice that said nothing at all. Walking back to Mill Lane in the cold October dark, Miss Marple thought that Hartwell-on-Wye was a very quiet village, and that quiet villages, in her experience, were rarely as quiet as they appeared. Chapter 2. Mrs. Prentice sets things in order. Audrey Prentice had been the organising force of Hartwell-on-Wye for as long as most of its residents could remember, and she organised it, as she organised everything, with a thoroughness that left little room for the unexpected. She was the sort of woman who prepared for events that had not yet been scheduled and preempted difficulties that had not yet arisen, and who ran the parish fete, the Mothers' Union magazine, and the Knitting Society with the calm authority of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that if she did not do things, they would not be done properly. She was also, as Miss Spark put it to Agnes Fellows over the garden wall on Friday morning, in possession of information that she has not always used with the greatest of discretion. Agnes, who was holding a trug and wearing her gardening gloves and a slightly guilty expression, said, "Now, Winifred, I say this not unkindly," Miss Spark said. "Audrey keeps records. I have always suspected it. The way she remembers the specific things that are slightly embarrassing to the person involved." She pruned a dead stem from Agnes's climbing rose with the brisk efficiency of someone who has made a considered moral point and moved on. She knew about Ruth's business with the solicitor 3 years ago. She knew that Oliver Fenn had been turned down for the council seat before he told anyone. She knows something about Mrs. Holt, I am fairly certain, and I think Mrs. Holt knows she knows it. Miss Marple, who was sitting on Agnes's garden bench with her knitting and giving every appearance of being absorbed in it, said, "What sort of something?" Miss Spark looked at her. She had assessed Miss Marple on Tuesday evening and arrived at a correct estimate, which put her ahead of most people. "I don't know the specifics," she said, "but Audrey has been to the county records office twice in the past month, which I know because my cousin works there, and she has been writing letters, to London mostly." "Has Mrs. Holt been to the records office?" "Not that I know of, but she's been to see the solicitor, Mr. Carver, Wednesday morning." Miss Marple absorbed this peacefully. "And Mrs. Prentice, is she the sort of woman who uses what she knows?" Miss Spark pruned another stem. She would say she uses it for the right reasons. She would say she simply ensures that things and people are as they present themselves to be. A pause. The question of whether that is a right reason rather depends on what one intends to do with the answer. Agnes looked troubled. "Do you think Audrey is in some kind of difficulty?" "I think," Miss Spark said with precision, "that Audrey may have put herself in a position that she would not have put herself in if she had thought it through more carefully, which is unlike her and therefore notable." Miss Marple returned to her cottage reflecting on this while she and Agnes made soup for lunch. She thought about records offices and letters to London, and a woman in a corner chair who checked the position of her hands every few minutes, as though they might have moved without her noticing. She thought also about a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead, a Mrs. Weatherby who had made a practice of knowing things about her neighbours, and had done so with the best possible intentions, and had nonetheless, by the time she died, been the most quietly disliked person in the village. The intentions had not protected the people she had investigated, and they had not protected her. On Saturday morning, Agnes received a telephone call from Ruth Calloway, who had heard from Oliver Fenn, who had been in the King's Head on Friday evening, that Audrey Prentice had telephoned Josephine Holt on Thursday afternoon, and that the conversation had lasted 40 minutes and had apparently not concluded in any satisfactory way for either party. Oliver was in the snug, Agnes told Miss Marple, somewhat apologetically. and Mr. Holt came in afterwards and had 2 large whiskies without speaking to anyone, which Oliver felt was significant. It is significant, Miss Marple agreed. Most men having an unremarkable evening do not drink 2 large whiskies in rapid and silent succession. What do you think is going on, Aunt Jane? She was not, in fact, Agnes's aunt, but Agnes had called her that for 40 years, and it had long ago become simply true. I think, Miss Marple said, that Mrs. Prentice has found out something about Mrs. Holt, that Mrs. Holt would very much prefer to remain unfound. And I think that both women are managing the situation in ways that are unlikely to end well. Should someone speak to Audrey? Someone should certainly speak to Audrey, Miss Marple said. I rather think I shall. But she did not, as it transpired, get the opportunity. On Sunday evening, at approximately 7 o'clock, Mrs. Audrey Prentice was found dead in the parlour of number 14 Glebe Road by Oliver Fenn, who had called to return the biscuit tin she had lent him, and who had found the front door standing open, and Mrs. Prentice in her armchair, with her knitting in her lap, and her tea on the side table, and no indication, at first glance, of any reason why she should not simply be asleep. She was not asleep. Chapter 3. The Open Door on Glebe Road. The doctor who came was Dr. Alma Bryce, who ran the single-handed practice from the converted house on Church Street, and who was, at 41, one of the few women GPs in that part of the county, and one of the most competent people in Hartwell by any measure. She arrived at Glebe Road at 7:20, and spent 12 minutes with the body before she came to speak to the small cluster of people in the hallway. Oliver Fenn was there, pale, holding the biscuit tin, clearly not sure what to do with it. Agnes Fellows had come because Oliver had telephoned her in a state of distress. Miss Marple had come with Agnes. Constable Higgs, the village policeman, was present and had already called Fernham for assistance. Dr. Bryce was a brisk, dark-haired woman with the manner of someone accustomed to situations that did not resolve tidily. She looked at the group and addressed herself, with some instinct, primarily to Miss Marple. The cause of death is not immediately apparent, she said. She is not young and there is no sign of violence. However, there are 1 or 2 things I'm not comfortable with, and I've told Constable Higgs that I want a post-mortem before anything is concluded. What sort of things? Miss Marple asked, with the mildness that was her most effective instrument. She appears to have been unwell before she died. There is evidence of vomiting, and her colour. Dr. Bryce paused. It is possible this was a natural cardiac or vascular event. It is also possible that it was not. I would rather know which. The tea on the side table, Miss Marple said. Was it her own making? Dr. Bryce looked at her steadily. I've asked Constable Higgs to have it tested. A pause. You are Miss Marple, Agnes Fellows' friend. I am. Agnes has mentioned you. A further pause. The door was open when Mr. Fenn arrived. Mrs. Prentice was not the sort of woman to leave her front door open. She was extremely particular about it. She mentioned it at the last parish committee meeting when she was proposing better locks for the hall. Oliver Fenn made a small sound. She did. She was very firm. She said unlocked doors were an invitation. They are, Miss Marple said, very quietly, occasionally a consequence. Sergeant Reeves arrived from Fernham at 8:30, a younger man than Baines, 35, efficient, with the lean alertness of someone who had recently transferred from a city posting and had not yet been fully assimilated by village pace. He went through the house with the contained thoroughness of someone doing things properly, and he interviewed each person present in the small dining room that Mrs. Prentice had kept for the purpose of having things done properly. When Miss Marple's turn came, she told him what she had observed at the Knitting Society on Thursday and the details of Mrs. Prentice's low-voiced exchange with Mrs. Holt in the hall. Reeves noted this. He noted it with the specific kind of attention that meant it was already consistent with something else he had been told. Mrs. Holt, he said. She is a member of the Knitting Society. She came to Hartwell 18 months ago from Northumberland. She was in insurance administration before that, she told me, though she paused slightly before saying so. Miss Marple folded her hands. Mrs. Prentice had been visiting the County Records Office and writing letters to London. Miss Spark told me this, and Miss Spark, in my experience, is precise. You think Mrs. Prentice had found something out about Mrs. Holt. I think it is a reasonable hypothesis. She paused. I also think the open front door is suggestive. A person who has visited someone and found them ill or unexpectedly dead might panic and leave without closing the door. A person who has done something and wishes to suggest that others had access to the house might leave it open deliberately. That's a significant difference, Reeves said. Yes, agreed Miss Marple. It rather is. She walked back to Mill Lane with Agnes in the cold dark, and Agnes was very quiet, which was her manner when she was frightened and trying not to show it. At the gate of the cottage, Agnes said, "Do you think Audrey was murdered, Jane?" "I think Dr. Bryce is right to want to know," Miss Marple said. "And I think that until we do know, everyone in Hartwell-on-Wye should be somewhat careful of their tea." Chapter 4. What Insurance Administration Conceals. The post-mortem results took 4 days, which is 4 days during which a village of 1,200 people conducts a parallel and unofficial investigation of its own, primarily in the post office, the King's Head, and over garden walls, and arrives at conclusions that are occasionally correct for the wrong reasons. The official conclusion, when it came, was aconitine poisoning. Aconitine, an alkaloid derived from monkshood, the plant called wolfsbane, a tall, dark-flowered thing that grew in cottage gardens, and was beautiful, and was one of the oldest and most reliable plant-based poisons in England's long and varied history of using such things. It had been in the tea, the concentration was precise, and the effect on a woman of 62 with a modestly weakened heart would have been rapid and would, without specific toxicological attention, have presented plausibly as cardiac failure. Miss Marple, told this by Agnes, who had been told by Ruth Calloway, who had a cousin in the Fernham police station typing pool, sat for rather a long time with her knitting and thought about monkshood. It grew in several of the cottage gardens in Hartwell-on-Wye. She had noticed it herself, the tall, dark spires, the distinctively hooded flowers. It was not exotic. It required knowledge to use, however. You could not simply crush the leaves into tea. You needed to know the extraction, the concentration, the correct part of the plant, and the correct time of year for maximum alkaloid content. This was not a poisoner who had been inspired by opportunity. This was a poisoner who had prepared. Sergeant Reeves came to see her on Thursday morning, which meant he had decided she was worth talking to further, which she took as a compliment in the spirit in which it was intended. "Mrs. Holt," he said, without preamble, setting his notebook on Agnes's kitchen table, "her background in Northumberland. I've been making inquiries." "Yes," said Miss Marple encouragingly. Her name before marriage was Josephine Anker. She worked for a company called Northern Provincial Insurance from 1946 to 1953. She left or was asked to leave. The records are somewhat ambiguous following an internal inquiry into the handling of a number of claims. No criminal prosecution was brought, but the internal finding was that certain documents had been manipulated to support fraudulent claims from a small number of policyholders, and Mrs. Holt was implicated. She was not the architect that appears to have been a man named Harold Vere, who was subsequently convicted of fraud in a different matter in 1955, but she was present and participating in a support capacity, and the company quietly removed her rather than pursue it formally. It was the sort of settlement that suits no one perfectly and everyone sufficiently, and this is what Mrs. Prentice found. We believe so. We've spoken to the records office in Fernham. She visited twice and obtained copies of county business registry documents and some historical newspaper records. We've also traced a letter she sent to the offices of Northern Provincial in London, asking for confirmation of a former employee's service record. He paused. She received a reply. We found the reply in a desk drawer in the study. It confirmed the dates of Mrs. Holt's employment and noted, diplomatically, that her departure had been under circumstances that the company was not in a position to detail. "Diplomatic," Miss Marple said, "but sufficiently clear." "Sufficiently clear," he agreed. "Mrs. Prentice has had a niece who was proposing to invest in a business with Mrs. Holt, a small catering enterprise. Mrs. Prentice wrote to her niece on the 14th of October, 3 days before the Knitting Society meeting. We found the draft." "Ah," said Miss Marple. "The niece has confirmed she received the letter. She says she had not yet spoken to Mrs. Holt, said she was deciding how to proceed." He looked at his notebook. So Mrs. Prentice had written to the niece, and then, we believe, she also confronted Mrs. Holt directly. The telephone call on Thursday, and Mrs. Holt knew that the letter to the niece had already been sent. If she did, and we don't yet know whether Mrs. Prentice told her, then the damage was already done. The information was already in circulation. Yes, Miss Marple said, but knowledge that information exists and where it came from might still make a difference. If Mrs. Prentice had kept records of her research copies, correspondence which she had, in the study, quite organized, and if those records were found and removed, The remaining evidence would be the letter to the niece and the company's diplomatic reply, neither of which is quite definitive enough for what Mrs. Holt might fear. The study, Reeves said carefully, showed signs of having been searched. It was not ransacked, it was done neatly. But Mrs. Prentice was an extremely organized woman, and certain sections of the desk had been disturbed in a way that was not consistent with her methods. The murderer looked for the research file, Miss Marple said, and may or may not have found it. May or may not, Reeves confirmed. We have not located a consolidated research folder. We don't know whether one existed or whether, if it did, it was taken. Miss Marple thought about this. She thought about Josephine Holt's steady hands and measured voice, and the precise way she placed her stitches. She thought about a woman who had managed a difficult situation once before the insurance inquiry and had survived it through other people's decisions not to prosecute. A woman who had learned something from that experience about the gap between what could be proven and what merely was true. Has Mrs. Holt been interviewed? She asked. Twice. She denies any significant conversation with Mrs. Prentice on Thursday. She says the exchange in the hallway was about the bazaar arrangements. He paused. Her husband confirms she was at home from 6 o'clock on Sunday evening. He confirms it, Miss Marple repeated, with the particular emphasis she placed on confirmation offered by the immediately interested party. He does. Reeves closed his notebook. Monkshood grows in 3 gardens on Glebe Road. One of them is Mrs. Prentice's own. Another belongs to the Holts. Chapter 5. The Garden at the Back of the House. Hartwell-on-Wye had the kind of gardens that are the product of long and particular attention. Not grand gardens, but good ones, where things grew because they had been considered and placed. The cottage borders were generous with herbs and cottage perennials, and in more than one front plot, the tall, dark spires of Monkshood stood in the back of the borders, where their somewhat sinister character could be partly concealed by lower-growing things. Miss Marple, who had a thorough knowledge of poisonous plants as a Category 1, developed over many decades of pottering in English gardens, knew that Monkshood was not unusual in such a setting. She also knew that knowing it was there and knowing what to do with it were separated by a considerable distance of specialist information. She called on Ruth Calloway on Friday morning, ostensibly to return a magazine Agnes had borrowed, and found Ruth in the kitchen making pastry with the focused application of a woman using her hands to manage a troubled mind. I cannot believe it was aconitine, Ruth said, working the fat into the flour with unnecessary vigor. It sounds Victorian. It sounds like something from a novel. It is rather old-fashioned, Miss Marple agreed, settling at the kitchen table, but extremely reliable, I understand, in the right preparation. Someone with pharmaceutical knowledge, or botanical expertise, or simply a great deal of research and patience could manage it. Who would know how? In Hartwell? Someone with the right background, Miss Marple considered. Did you know that Mrs. Holt had worked in insurance? She mentioned it once. Administration, she said. Before that, before the insurance work, did she say what she had done? Ruth thought about this with the pinched expression of someone dredging a reliable memory. She said at one of the early meetings, when we were all talking about our pasts, she said she had trained as a nurse for 2 years, in the late 30s, but she had given it up. A pause. She didn't say why. Miss Marple was still for a moment. 2 years of nursing training would give a person a working knowledge of pharmacology, of toxic compounds and their effects, of dosing. Josephine Holt, Ruth said, staring at her pastry. Oh Lord, I'm not certain, Miss Marple said quickly. I'm thinking aloud. It's a habit. You think she did it? Ruth set down the bowl. The way she looked at Audrey on Thursday, I noticed it. I thought it was just their difficulty with the bazaar, but there was something else in it, something harder than that. What sort of something? As though Audrey had something that belonged to her, something she wanted back. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's an odd way to put it. No, said Miss Marple. It's rather a precise way to put it. She walked home by the longer route, which took her along the bottom of Glebe Road and past the front of number 14, where a police notice was still affixed to the gate and the curtains were drawn. She walked slowly, and as she passed the house next to Mrs. Prentice's number 12, occupied by an elderly Mr. Tate who grew vegetables competitively and roses sentimentally, she noticed that the monkshood in the Prentice border, visible over the low garden wall, had been recently cut back. Not the whole plant, only the upper portions, the seed heads and the remaining late flowers, cut with a blade, not broken, done neatly, with care. She looked at this for a moment without stopping. She walked on. At Agnes's cottage, she sat at the writing desk in the spare room and made careful notes. She wrote down what she knew, what she suspected, and the specific gap between them. The gap was not small. She had a motive of considerable weight, a woman with relevant knowledge, a prior history of managed dishonesty, a pair of conversations that couldn't be proven, and a garden coincidence. None of it was evidence. All of it was an argument. What she needed was something that connected Josephine Holt to the preparation of the poison, or something that connected her to the kitchen at Glebe Road on Sunday evening, where the tea had been made. She thought about the open front door. She thought about what it meant. It had not been left open to suggest a stranger. Hartwell-on-Wye was not the sort of village where strangers were plausible actors in domestic deaths. It had been left open, if it had been left open deliberately, to suggest panic, to suggest someone who had stumbled upon the death and fled without thinking to close the door, which created the possibility of an unknown discoverer who had not come forward. Or, and this was the more interesting possibility, the door had been left open because closing it required a key, and the murderer had not had a key and had slipped out while Mrs. Prentice was already dying and before she was fully dead. Either way, it meant the murderer had been in the house while Mrs. Prentice was still alive, standing in that polished parlour, in the amber light, watching. Miss Marple set down her pen and looked out the window at Agnes's garden, where the last of the dahlias were finishing and the borders were being folded in on themselves by autumn. She thought about what manner of person could stand in a room and watch. Chapter 6. Mr. Barnaby Holt receives a visitor. Barnaby Holt was a quiet man, which is not the same as a simple one. He was 52, medium height, grey at the temples, with a face that had organised itself over many years into an expression of careful neutrality. He kept the accounts for 4 local businesses, including the solicitor's firm and the grain merchant on the Furnham Road, and he was known in the village as reliable, which meant people paid him promptly and did not particularly think about him otherwise. Miss Marple called at the Holt house on Saturday morning on the pretext of collecting for the Mothers' Union, a collection that was perfectly genuine and that she had offered to assist with partly for this reason. She was invited in with the cautious courtesy of a man who does not invite people in easily, but who cannot, in conscience, refuse a small elderly woman collecting for the Mothers' Union. The house was tidy in a specific way, not warm tidy, the kind that accumulates over years of ordinary living, but managed tidy, the kind that is the product of continuous vigilance. Everything in its place, no accumulation. The sitting room had the quality of a room that was regularly returned to a neutral state, as though habitation were periodically undone. Josephine Holt was not at home. Mr. Holt said so with the slightly heightened attention of a man for whom this was relevant information. "She's gone into Furnham," he said. "Shopping." "Of course." Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea she was offered and looked around the room with the unhurried interest of someone who is old enough that interest of this kind is considered harmless. "It must be a very difficult time. Poor Mrs. Prentice. Did you know her well?" "Passingly," he said, "through Joe's knitting group." He sat down with his own cup, not quite at ease. She seemed like a capable woman, very, rather fond of organising things. Miss Marple considered. "I believe she and Mrs. Holt had some disagreement. About the Christmas bazaar, something like that." His voice was level, but his hands, she noted, placed his teacup down with slightly more force than the table required. "People can be very territorial about bazaars," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I have seen lifelong friendships ended over the arrangement of a tombola, I imagine. I wonder and forgive an old woman's curiosity. Did your wife come home at the usual time on Sunday evening?" He looked at her. He had been looking at her with the measured look of a man deciding what she was and whether she was dangerous, and now the measuring was complete. He had decided, she thought, that she was something between an inconvenience and a problem, and he was not yet sure which. "She was home by 6, he said, "as I told the sergeant." "Of course." "Yes." Miss Marple smiled. "I only ask because I happen to notice, and this is probably quite irrelevant, that the monk's hood in Mrs. Prentice's front border had been cut back recently, the upper portions, and I wondered who might have done it, since Mrs. Prentice was clearly not in a position to have done it herself, and the police have been in the garden since Monday." There was a pause that was perhaps 1.5 seconds longer than it needed to be. "I wouldn't know about that," he said. "No, probably nothing at all." She finished her tea and set the Mothers' Union tin on the side table, in a gesture that reminded him why she had come. "One more thing, I am sorry to be tiresome, But does your wife have any botanical interest? Gardening? I noticed you have a lovely monkshood specimen by the back gate. Joe grows several things, he said. His voice had gone very flat. She was a nurse, briefly. Knows a bit about plants, herbs and so on. He stood. I should see you out, Miss Marple. I have work. Of course. She stood, accepting her hat and gloves from him with the gracious slowness that is the privilege of age. At the door she paused. She had found that pausing at doors produced results with some regularity. Mr. Holt, I realize this is presumptuous, but I have lived a long time, and I have learned that people who protect others from the consequences of their actions are not, in the end, protecting them. He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not quite grief, not quite anger, but something that had both in it. Good morning, Miss Marple, he said, and closed the door. She walked back to Mill Lane slowly, turning over what she had seen. A man who had confirmed his wife's alibi and was the alibi's only source. A house managed into neutrality. A man whose face, in that final moment, had not been the face of someone defending the innocent. It had been the face of someone who knew what had been done and had made a decision to stand alongside it regardless, with the particular resignation of a man who has weighed his choices and does not like any of them. Chapter 7. The Ledger. Mrs. Prentice did not finish. Miss Spark came to Agnes's cottage on Saturday afternoon with information she had organised into a precise mental sequence and delivered with the efficiency of a retired postmistress, thoroughly, in order, without unnecessary embellishment. Audrey kept a ledger, she said, settling into the kitchen chair she had apparently selected as most suitable and accepting tea. I know this because she mentioned it to me in 1954 during a difficulty with the village hall accounts. She said she made a practice of keeping a personal record of significant matters, significant being her word, which might mean anything from the minutes of a parish meeting to something more personal. She paused. The police have been through her study and her writing desk and her filing cabinet, but I don't believe they have found the ledger. What makes you think so? Because if they had found it, Sergeant Reeves would not still have the expression of a man who is missing a piece. He was in the post office this morning, and he had a look. She drank her tea. I know where Audrey kept it. Agnes made a small sound. She kept it in the ottoman in the upstairs landing, the one with the hinged lid that has the broken lock. It looks as though it cannot be opened because the lock is broken, but the lid lifts quite freely from the right-hand side if you know to try it. Audrey told me during the accounts difficulty because she wanted me to understand that she kept records and that she took accuracy seriously. Miss Spark set down her cup. I have told Sergeant Reeves. You telephoned him this morning. After the post office? Yes, he has gone to look. She folded her hands. I thought you should know. Miss Marple thought she was rather fond of Winifred Spark. Was anything else in the ottoman to your knowledge? She mentioned correspondence she considered important, and what she called her research materials. The research materials on Mrs. Holt. I imagine so, yes. The call from Sergeant Reeves came at 4 o'clock. He had found the ottoman. He had found the ledger, and within it, a sealed envelope labelled in Mrs. Prentice's upright and characteristic hand for the attention of sergeant or inspector in the event of my death or incapacitation. This was the sort of preparation that was not quite paranoia and not quite prudence, but something between them, of the kind that an organised woman makes when she becomes aware she may have placed herself in a specific kind of danger. The envelope contained 6 pages. The first 3 were a summary of Mrs. Prentice's research into Josephine Holt, the records, the Northern Provincial Inquiry, the nature of the fraud, the names of the individuals involved. The 4th was a copy of the letter she had sent to the company and their reply. The 5th was a record of the telephone conversation on Thursday, October the 16th, written out from memory immediately afterwards, including the specific things Mrs. Holt had said. Reeves read to Miss Marple from the 5th page, with the slightly formal delivery of a man quoting from an official document. Mrs. Holt stated that the inquiry had been resolved and that there was no record of any wrongdoing attached to her name. She stated that any attempt to pursue the matter would be met with legal action for defamation. She stated that my niece's business was her own affair and that interference would not be tolerated. She then said, and I am recording this as precisely as I recall it, that I should consider very carefully, before continuing with a course of action that I might find was more costly than I had anticipated. The phrase she used was, more costly than you can afford. I understood this to be a threat, though its precise nature was unclear to me. More costly than you can afford, Miss Marple repeated softly, and Mrs. Prentice understood it as a threat. She wrote it down immediately. The 6th page. Reeves paused. The 6th page is a note she wrote that same evening. It says, "I have placed a copy of the relevant documents in the ottoman in addition to this account. I intend to speak to Sergeant Higgs on Monday. If I do not do so, it will be because something has prevented me. In that case, this should be found." She knew, Agnes said, very quietly. She knew something might happen, Miss Marple said. She didn't know what, precisely, or when. She was cautious enough to record it, not cautious enough to tell someone immediately. A pause. Or perhaps she meant to, and there wasn't time. The 6th page, Reeves said, makes the telephone conversation documented evidence. It establishes that Mrs. Holt made a threat. It establishes a motive. He closed his notebook. "I'm bringing Mrs. Holt in for questioning tomorrow morning. She will have an explanation for the threat," Miss Marple said. "She is a careful woman. She is. But she is also a woman whose monkshood has been partially harvested, and who has 2 years of nursing training and 20 years of insurance work, and who has no alibi except her husband." He paused. "We're looking more closely at Mr. Holt as well." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I think that is wise." Chapter 8. What the knitting told her. Miss Marple knitted through Sunday morning with the industrious quietness of a person solving something, and Agnes, who had learned over many years to recognize this state, made tea and stayed out of the way. The thing she was working through was not the question of Josephine Holt's guilt. She had formed a settled opinion about that, which was that Josephine Holt had prepared the poison and introduced it into the tea, and had stood in that polished parlour and watched it take effect. The thing she was working through was the mechanism, because the mechanism mattered for 2 reasons. 1, it was what the evidence needed to establish, and 2, it told her something about the particular character of the murderer that she found she wanted to understand. She had been a nurse for 2 years. She had worked in insurance fraud for 7, and had managed the inquiry that followed with a combination of implication and distance, close enough to the centre to participate, far enough from it to survive. She had come to Hartwell not entirely by chance. Hartwell was where a new life was available, where no one knew her history, where a business venture with a niece who trusted her could be built. And then Audrey Prentice had begun writing letters to London. The preparation of aconitine from monkshood was not simple, but it was documented. The information was in botanical and pharmaceutical texts that were available in any good county library. A woman with 2 years of nursing training and 30 years of careful attention to how things worked would have found it manageable. She would have used gloves. One did not handle fresh monkshood without them, as the alkaloid absorbed through skin. She would have had a small quantity of solvent and the patience to reduce the extraction. She would have tested the concentration against what Miss Marple did not wish to dwell on, and she would have prepared a small vial. The delivery, the tea, Mrs. Prentice's own tea, made in her own kitchen. This meant Josephine Holt had been in the kitchen. This meant she had been inside the house. She had not broken in there, and there was no sign of that. She had been admitted. Mrs. Prentice had opened the door to her on Sunday evening and let her in, and perhaps made tea for them both, or perhaps begun to make it, and left the room briefly, which is all the time one needed. Why had Mrs. Prentice let her in? Because Josephine Holt had asked to come and resolve the matter. Because the telephone call had ended badly, and a follow-up visit, conducted in the right tone, conciliatory, reasonable, was the natural next step. Mrs. Prentice, who believed in facing things directly, would have agreed. She had believed she was managing a difficult situation. She had not known what she was letting through the door. The open door. Miss Marple stopped knitting for a moment. The open door had been left open, she now thought, not for concealment. It had been left open for a simpler reason. Josephine Holt had expected Mr. Fenn or someone else to find Mrs. Prentice quickly, before a post-mortem could be arranged as routine. A woman found dead alone in a locked house would immediately prompt investigation. A woman found dead in a house with the door standing open would prompt the question of whether she had been unwell and had opened it for air, or had been expecting someone and opened it in anticipation. The open door was meant to suggest a natural collapse, not to suggest a visitor. It had been a slight miscalculation. Dr. Bryce had not been convinced. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again. The question remaining was Barnaby Holt. He had confirmed the alibi. He had sat in the King's Head and drunk 2 whiskies. Had he been at home from 6 onwards and therefore genuinely able to confirm that his wife was also at home? Or had they coordinated? Had he known, and when had he known what his wife had done? His face, at the door, not the face of someone defending the innocent, but also not the face of someone who had helped plan it. The whiskies at the King's Head suggested a man managing something he had not anticipated, not a man completing a shared scheme. She thought he had not known in advance. She thought he had come home before 6, or at 6 and found his wife in a specific state, and had understood, and had made a choice. The choice of a man who has decided that the life he has built with a woman is worth more than the alternative, even if the alternative is the truth. It was, she reflected, a very human choice. It was also a very wrong one. She would speak to Sergeant Reeves about Barnaby Holt, but there was one thing she wanted to try first. One small observation she wanted to make in person, which she could not make from a distance, and which might confirm or complicate everything she believed. Chapter 9. An afternoon call and its consequences. On Monday afternoon, Miss Marple called on Josephine Holt. She had told Agnes she was going for a walk. This was not exactly untrue. She had also told Sergeant Reeves what she intended to do, and he had been silent on the telephone for long enough that she understood he disapproved, and had decided not to say so, which amounted to permission. The Holt house was as managed and neutral as it had been on Saturday, except that the back garden was visible through the sitting-room window, and from here, on a clear autumn afternoon, the plant by the back gate was plainly not what it had been 2 weeks ago. The cuts were precise. The upper third of the plant was gone. Josephine Holt answered the door herself. She was composed. She had been composed at the Knitting Society and at the flower show, and Miss Marple suspected during the conversation at Mrs. Prentice's kitchen table, and she was composed now. It was a quality she wore like a coat, and it was, Miss Marple thought, genuinely part of her rather than a performance, which made it more rather than less interesting. Miss Marple. A pause that was not quite a surprise, and not quite its absence. "Please come in." They sat in the tidy sitting-room. Josephine Holt did not offer tea, which was a choice. Miss Marple sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the room and then at the woman. "I expect Sergeant Reeves has told you about Mrs. Prentice's ledger," Miss Marple said, without preamble. "He spoke to me this morning, yes, and the note she made about your telephone conversation. She misrepresented what I said. The voice was even. A phrase like, 'more costly than you can afford,' is a figure of speech. I meant that pursuing a defamation action is expensive and time-consuming. I was suggesting she reconsider for her own sake." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is a very competent explanation." Something in Josephine Holt's face adjusted slightly. Not much. She was too controlled for much. But something. "You are rather good," Miss Marple continued, in the same pleasant tone, "at the management of explanations. You were good at it during the insurance inquiry, not good enough to avoid the inquiry, but good enough to survive it without prosecution. You were good enough at it to build a new life here, and to present yourself as someone whose past was an ordinary one." She paused. "The nursing training was not on any of the documents that Mrs. Prentice found. I imagine it was deliberately omitted from your recent history." "I trained briefly," Mrs. Holt said. "It was a long time ago. It's not relevant to anything." "It would be relevant to the preparation of aconitine from monkshood," Miss Marple said, "which requires a knowledge of extraction and dosing that is not commonly available." She looked at the window, and the garden, and the neat cut stems of the plant by the gate. "Your monkshood is very fine. I noticed it on Saturday when Mr. Holt showed me out. Monkshood grows in half the gardens in Hartwell." "It does. The upper portions of your specimen have been removed recently, however, within the past 10 days, I would estimate. Seed heads, late flowers, the upper stems." She looked at Josephine Holt very directly. "Those are the parts of the plant with the highest concentration of aconitine at this time of year." Josephine Holt looked back. Her face had gone very still, in the way of someone who has decided that stillness is the only available resource. "You have no evidence of anything, Miss Marple. You have a plant that has been pruned, and a theory." "I have a good deal more than that," Miss Marple said. "The police have the ledger. They have the letter. They have your nursing history and your connection to the plant. They have no independent confirmation of your whereabouts on Sunday evening, other than your husband, who I think is a man in a very uncomfortable position." She paused. "I came here not to accuse you. Sergeant Reeves is quite capable of doing that. I came because I wanted to see whether you would tell me why." "Why?" A flat repetition. Mrs. Prentice was not a kind woman in all her methods. She used what she knew, but she was not, in herself, a cruel or vicious person, and she had a genuine reason for what she did. She was protecting her niece from a dishonest business partner. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. I find that I want to understand the shape of it. Why that response, and not a different one? Why not simply deny, or leave Hartwell, or manage the niece through other means? Josephine Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, with a sudden, exhausted precision, "Because I have spent 15 years managing consequences, and I was finished with it. Because I had built something here, and I was not going to have it taken again." A pause. "It has always been taken. Every time I have built something, someone finds the crack and takes it. And so you took something instead." The room was very quiet. Outside, a wood pigeon made its soft, repetitive sound in the oak beyond the gate. "You should go," Josephine Holt said. "I think you should go now." Miss Marple went. At the end of the path she met Sergeant Reeves coming the other way, which was not, she thought, a coincidence. "Did you hear?" she asked. "Enough," he said. Chapter 10. The Uses of a Husband's Silence. Josephine Holt was taken to the Fernham police station at 4 o'clock on Monday afternoon and was charged on Tuesday morning. She said very little beyond confirming her name and declining to answer questions until her solicitor arrived, which was, Miss Marple reflected, perfectly sensible and exactly what one would expect from a woman who had spent 20 years managing difficult circumstances through calculated composure. What was less expected, or perhaps, on reflection, not unexpected at all, was Barnaby Holt. He came to the police station on Tuesday evening. Sergeant Reeves told Miss Marple on Wednesday morning, sat down across the interview table with the look of a man who had arrived at a decision through a long and painful process and intended to complete it now that he had started. He said that he had not known in advance what his wife had done. He said that he had arrived home on Sunday evening at 5:30, not 6, as he had previously stated, and had found his wife in the kitchen washing her hands with unusual thoroughness. He had not asked her what she had been doing. He had poured himself a drink at home, not at the King's Head, which came later, and had sat in the garden for 20 minutes and made a decision. He had then driven to the King's Head and drunk 2 whiskies and came home and told the sergeant, when asked, that Josephine had been home from 6, not from 5:30, a small adjustment, one that cost Mrs. Prentice nothing further, since she was already dead, and that protected his wife from a question about the missing 30 minutes. "Why did you change it?" Reeves had asked him. He had said, "Because 23 years is a long time, and I thought perhaps I was wrong about what I had understood, that I was constructing something that wasn't there, that it was a coincidence. And now I know I wasn't. You are telling me this now because I am not able to continue not telling it," he had said, with the flatness of a man saying the truest possible thing. "I thought I could. I can't." Miss Marple, hearing this account, thought about Barnaby Holt's face at the door of his house when she had spoken to him on Saturday. She had seen in it something she had identified as resignation, and she had been right about the resignation, but she had not been right about its character. She had thought it the resignation of a man who had decided on a course and was settled in it. It was actually, she now understood, the resignation of a man who had decided on a course and was already uncertain whether he could hold on to it. He had held it for 3 days. It was, she supposed, something. Not much, but something. The evidence assembled, Mrs. Prentice's ledger and its sealed note, the letter to the insurance company and their reply. The telephone conversation was recorded, the nursing history, the harvested monkshood, the trace aconitine that the laboratory found in the soil at the base of the plant, where cutting debris had fallen. The vial is small, amber glass, with a rubber stopper discovered in the lining of a coat in Josephine Holt's wardrobe, which the police found on a second search once they knew what they were looking for. The revised account from Barnaby Holt. It was, Sergeant Reeves said, quite sufficient. Miss Spark, when she heard about the vial, made the sound of someone whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. The coat lining, she said, in Agnes's kitchen, where she had appeared with a fruitcake and the information on Wednesday afternoon. She didn't throw it away because disposing of it was a problem. Where do you put a small glass vial in a village? Everything is noticed. She kept meaning to find a better moment, and the better moment did not arrive. The impeccably tidy house, Agnes said, still somewhat dazed by the week's events, and a vial in the coat lining. Even methodical people, Miss Marple said gently, are not methodical under pressure at every moment. The pressure of keeping the rest of it in order was considerable. The vial was the one thing she had not yet solved. She nearly got away with it, Agnes said. She nearly did, Miss Marple agreed. Dr. Bryce's thoroughness prevented it, and Mrs. Prentice's own thoroughness, the sealed note, the ledger, was a kind of posthumous resistance that Mrs. Holt could not have anticipated. She paused. Audrey Prentice, for all her faults, was a woman who believed things should be recorded and that the record should be accessible. She was right about that, even if she went about it in ways that made people uncomfortable. She was trying to protect her niece, Agnes said. She was, and she did, in the end, posthumously. Miss Marple looked at her knitting, which had been more or less untouched for 3 days, and was beginning to seem reproachful. The niece will find another business partner. She will be more careful about references this time. Miss Spark ate fruitcake with the air of someone who has discharged their civic duty and is now entitled to refreshment. What will happen to Mr. Holt? He will be charged with obstruction, Reeves had told Miss Marple. Given that he came forward and corrected the statement, the charge will likely be modest. He had paused. He is not, in himself, a bad man. No, Miss Marple had said. He is a man who loved someone unwisely and then made a small wrong choice in her defense, and then found he could not maintain it. People do both of those things rather regularly. Chapter 11. The Society Reconvenes. The November meeting of the Hartwell-on-Wye Knitting Society took place at Ruth Calloway's house, since the parlour at number 14 Glebe Road was not yet in a condition practically or emotionally to receive company. Ruth's house was slightly smaller, and the biscuits were homemade shortbread rather than the hunting scene tin variety, and there were only 5 members instead of 7, which left 2 empty chairs that everyone was aware of without saying so. Miss Marple was still in Hartwell. Agnes's chest had not quite resolved, or so Agnes said, and Miss Marple was content to remain where there was still something to observe. She was aware that this was a mild fiction on both their parts. Agnes's chest was improving well, but the fiction was mutually agreeable. Oliver Fenn arrived with a new ball of dark blue wool and the subdued air of a man who had found a dead body 3 weeks ago and was not yet finished with thinking about it. He ate 3 pieces of shortbread and said very little, which was unlike him, and Ruth kept the teapot moving to compensate. "We should discuss the bazaar," Miss Spark said, after the first cup of tea had been consumed, and it had become clear that no one was going to initiate anything. "It's in 6 weeks. Audrey would have wanted it to proceed. Audrey would have wanted it to proceed under her direction," Ruth said, with a slight wobble in her voice that was not quite humour and not quite grief. "She would," Miss Spark agreed. "Since that is no longer possible, we shall have to manage under collective direction, which will be less efficient and probably more enjoyable." She looked at her needles. "I propose we each contribute individually, 2 items each, by December 1st. There was a general murmur of agreement, which was the sound of a group rediscovering its own authority. Miss Marple, in the corner chair that had become informally hers, watched Oliver Fenn find his way back to something approaching his normal self over the course of 2 more cups of tea and considerable shortbread. She watched Ruth Calloway's shoulders relax as the evening went on and the ordinary mechanics of the society reasserted themselves. She watched Miss Spark, who did not appear to change in any observable way, but who was, Miss Marple suspected, allowing herself a private measure of relief. She thought about Audrey Prentice, who had sat in this kind of circle for many years and had used her position in it, the information it gave her, the influence it provided, in ways that were not always what they should have been, and who had, nevertheless at the end, acted from a genuine impulse to protect someone. The ledger and the sealed note were not the actions of a woman who was merely accumulating power. They were the actions of a woman who knew, on some level, that she had walked into something real and wanted to ensure it did not go unmarked. "Miss Marple," Oliver Fenn said, during a comfortable lull, "you'll be going back to St. Mary Mead soon, I expect." "Before Christmas," she said. "Agnes will be quite well by then." "Agnes has been quite well for a week," Miss Spark said, without looking up. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed serenely, "though the country air continues to do her good." There was a ripple of something lighter through the room, not quite laughter, but its prelude. "You must have seen rather a lot of this sort of thing," Oliver Fenn said, with the slightly awed tentativeness of a man who wants to ask a question and is not sure whether it is appropriate. "In St. Mary Mead, over the years, one sees what there is to see," Miss Marple said. "The village is a very complete world. Everything that happens in larger settings happens in a village as well, on a smaller scale. The ambitions, the resentments, the long memories, The moments when someone decides that what they have is less than what they are owed. She paused. The difference is that in a village there is nowhere to disappear to. Everyone remains in the same rooms, and so the consequences of things are visible in a way they are not in a city. Josephine Holt tried to disappear, Oliver Fenn said. She came to Hartwell to disappear from something else, Miss Marple said, and she found that what she carried had come with her, and that in a village there was no further to go. She looked at her knitting, the blue bed jacket, nearly done now. That is the difficulty with running away from oneself. It is the one journey that reliably fails. The room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quality of a room in which something true has been said simply. "Well," said Ruth Calloway, reaching for the teapot, "shall I pour?" She poured, and the needles resumed their soft percussion, and the November evening sat warmly outside the curtains, and the society continued, as societies will, in the manner of things that survive their individual members. Chapter 12. The Blue Bed Jacket and Other Endings. Miss Marple finished the blue bed jacket on the penultimate day of November and gave it to Agnes over breakfast with the simplicity of someone presenting something that has been made with genuine care. Agnes held it up and looked at it and said it was exactly right, which it was, and put it on over her dressing gown, which was not perhaps the intended wearing occasion, but which seemed to Miss Marple an entirely suitable one. "Winifred was asking whether you'd consider staying through December," Agnes said, pouring more tea, with the studied casualness of a woman who has rehearsed this. "Winifred is kind," Miss Marple said, "but I should go home. There is a garden to see, and I have been away from St. Mary Mead for 6 weeks. She paused. "It is rather a long time to leave a village without observation." Agnes smiled. "I don't think St. Mary Mead will have misbehaved in your absence. It will have done something. Villages always do." She spent the morning making a methodical round of farewells to Miss Spark at the post office, to Ruth Calloway over tea, to Dr. Bryce, whom she had not seen since the early stages of the inquiry, and who received her with the measured respect of a professional encountering a peer across disciplines. "You knew quite early," Dr. Bryce said, in her direct way. "It was not quite a question. I had a strong hypothesis early," Miss Marple said. "The evidence came afterwards. It usually does." She paused. "Your decision to request the thorough post-mortem was the thing that made it possible. Without that, she would have been buried as a natural death, and nothing would have followed." Dr. Bryce was matter of fact. "I simply followed the procedure." "You followed instinct and called it procedure," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "which is what good practitioners do." Dr. Bryce gave a slight, contained smile that suggested she was not accustomed to being precisely understood. At Sergeant Reeves's office in Furnham, where she stopped on her way to the railway station, he had news from Leeds. Josephine Holt had been interviewed about a previous incident in her nursing training, 1938, in which a patient had died under circumstances that had been attributed to natural causes and had not been investigated further. The file was being reviewed. He said this with the carefully neutral tone of a man who has learned to present the most disturbing information in the most stable register. "She had done it before," Miss Marple said. "We believe it is possible. We cannot yet say more than that." "No," she stood. "She told me she had built things and they had always been taken from her. I believed the truth of the feeling, even while I knew what she had done with it." A pause. "There are people for whom the world is experienced primarily as a series of deprivations, and in whom this produces a particular response. It does not excuse the response, but it does explain it, if one wishes to understand." "Do you wish to understand?" Reeves asked, with genuine curiosity. "I always wish to understand," she said. "Understanding does not require approval." He drove her to the station himself, which she thought was a courtesy she had not quite earned and accepted with grace. On the platform he shook her hand, which was formal, and then said, "You ought to come to Furnham permanently, Miss Marple. Save us all a great deal of time." "I come where I am invited," she said, "and I find I am usually sent where I am needed." The train was on time, which in November was not guaranteed. She settled in the corner seat with her knitting bag. The blue jacket was in it now, completed, no longer needing to be worked on, though she had begun another project, a pair of gloves in grey wool for her nephew, who was always losing gloves. She thought, as the fields moved past in their wintry brown and grey, about Audrey Prentice, who had kept a ledger and written a sealed note, and had, in her last days, shown a quality of forethought that had outlasted her. She thought about Barnaby Holt, who had sat in the King's Head on a Sunday evening with 2 whiskies and made a wrong choice and then, 3 days later, sat in a police interview room and unmade it. She thought about Oliver Fenn and the hunting scene biscuit tin and the particular desolation of finding a dead body when one had only gone to return it. She thought about Josephine Holt, who had run as far as a person could run and had found that the border she could not cross was herself. There is, Miss Marple reflected, a particular kind of exhaustion in a person who has spent their life managing situations, managing information, managing the consequences of things they have done and not repented, and it accumulates. It accumulates because it never resolves. The management requires more management. The distance between the self that is presented and the self that is true requires constant maintenance, and constant maintenance is tiring, and in the tiredness, there are moments when the thing that seems most controlled is the thing that fails. In Josephine Holt's case, it had been a vial in a coat lining, a small glass thing she had not yet disposed of, because the problem of disposing of it had not yet been solved. It was always something small. In Miss Marple's experience, it was almost always something small. The train came into the junction at Furnham, changed its mind about something in the engine, and then proceeded with renewed purpose towards St Mary Mead, which sat at the end of the line in the mid-afternoon light, waiting to receive her in the way of places that are not aware they have been missed, but that have been missed nonetheless. She put her knitting away and looked out the window and felt, as she always did at this particular stage of things, the double-noted sensation of conclusion and continuation, the satisfaction of a properly finished thing, and the quiet forward turn toward whatever came next. The village was there. The garden required attention. There were any number of things in St Mary Mead that had very likely been happening in her absence, and that would repay examination. She gathered her bag and straightened her hat and stepped onto the platform into the cold December air and went home.